That night, Lydia Hart woke up to whispers from behind the bedroom door. Her husband, Colin Hart, was on the phone with his mother again at 3 a.m. His voice sounded strangely excited. Lydia lay still in the dark, catching fragments of their conversation. "We have to do this right," Colin insisted softly. "She won't suspect a thing." "Of course not, son," his mother, Evelyn, replied, her voice cold and certain. Lydia's chest tightened. What were they planning in secret? And why now, just weeks before their 25th anniversary? The floor creaked as Colin returned to the bedroom. Lydia shut her eyes quickly, pretending to sleep. He slipped into bed beside her, careful and restless, and she could feel the tension humming in his body. Something was coming. She didn't know what yet. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be love. He waited until the applause swelled and the chandelier light caught the rim of every glass, until the photographer crouched and the mayor took her seat and the blue banner reading Founders Day billowed like a crown. Then Colin Hart slid a manila envelope across the linen and leaned in close enough that his aftershave pooled inside Lydia's lungs. "Sign the deed tonight," he murmured, smiling for the donors as if he were sharing a love note. "Or I tell this room why the district is looking at your books." The microphone at the head of the stage gleamed. The lectern light burned a circle in the air. 100 faces, the string quartet resting between songs, the clink of forks and the low hush of money doing its favorite thing, watching itself be admired. Lydia stared at the envelope for a steady count of 3. She set her fingers on the thin flap like she was testing the temperature of a bath. She did not rip it open. She did not look afraid. She lifted her eyes and met her husband's smile and thought of their first apartment with the kitchen slanted as a hymn, of cheap coffee and floor fans and laughter that lived in the corners. She thought of her father's shaky hand signing trust papers at a banker's desk because he believed in quiet protections. She thought of a flash drive in her bag and a promise she'd made to herself in a kitchen 2 weeks earlier, while the kettle shrieked and a friend watched her hide shake itself into composure. If he builds a stage to strip you of your dignity, bring documents and a steady voice. She tilted the envelope back toward him. "Later," she said, the single syllable dropping as calm as rain. He held the smile. He squeezed her fingers for the camera, a gesture that would scan as tender in tomorrow's social posts. The squeeze hurt. She didn't flinch. The quartet looked over to the MC for a cue. The mayor lifted her glass. A little shiver of applause rose and fell again. Lydia looked toward the back of the hall where the exit light burned green and let her eyes rest there like a person calibrating a compass. 3 weeks earlier, a few minutes past 3 in the morning, the old pine floors in their bungalow had creaked in a way that felt like hush. Lydia Hart woke the way a woman learns to in middle age, beneath an unpretty clock of hormones and memories, alert to odd sounds without knowing why. She opened her eyes and watched the gray shape of the ceiling fan hover and stutter with each turn. Then she heard her husband's voice in the hallway, low and bright, a tone she had never associated with him except once, the first time he took a contract that seemed to promise a future years ago, before money was a language he spoke more lovingly than he spoke to her. "No, the timeline holds," Colin said. "She's clueless." "After the gala." "Yeah, Patrick. And Ev will keep her busy." "Patrick. Evelyn." The syllables threaded under the door and into their bedroom, into the soft place behind Lydia's sternum. She lowered her hand by the bed, found the phone on the nightstand, checked the time, and set it face down again. She lay still and listened. There were pauses, a chuckle she felt before she heard, another name she couldn't quite catch. The floorboard outside the door groaned. Old houses told on you, and logic assembled itself like a filing system. Minimize outward behavior, maximize listening. She closed her eyes as he came back into the room. Means of entry and exit collapsed into measured steps. She slid her mouth half open like she'd been sleeping hard. He put the mattress dip of his weight down with care, the carefulness of a man planting himself in a story where he was the hero. His breath kept its speedy cadence for a long while. She counted breaths the way she used to count seconds during timed math tests in the 6th grade. Calm, even. Nothing wasted. When his breathing slowed, she rolled to face the wall and watched the shadow of the tree outside sway. She pictured her father's workshop and the smell of sawdust. Pictured herself at 8, bending over a dollhouse he'd made from the scrap of a kitchen remodel. He had put a tiny hinge on the front so the whole facade swung open. When he handed it to her, he said, "We make the secret hinge for what we must keep safe." The next morning, the kettle steamed. The sky beyond the window was the low winter blue that makes mountains look farther away than usual. She poured Colin's coffee and set a spoon next to his mug, even though he never used a spoon. He came into the kitchen with a whiff of aftershave that wasn't his usual grocery store spice, but something expensive and intentioned. He kissed her cheek for longer than usual and put a hand on her waist like he was auditioning for tenderness and wasn't quite sure of the blocking. "How about we host a table this year?" he said. "Founders Day. We've never really done it right. I want everything to be perfect." The way he said perfect made a film inside her mouth. She stirred a kind of nothing into her own mug just to move. The phone on the counter dinged. The screen woke and threw up a rectangle of light. She hadn't touched it, and he hadn't either. It was his. A calendar alert blipped. 11 a.m. Call PV. She turned off the kettle even though it had already gone quiet. "Who's PV?" she asked. The words mild like the steam she lifted from the mug. He blinked before the words landed. It was the kind of blink that dried and reset the surface of a lie. "Plumbing vendor." "Vance," he said, adding the second word as if one proper noun could make another more plausible. "For the bungalow stuff." She nodded. He had retired from contracting last spring. He had sold the van, sold the table saw, framed his pictures of finished porches in a grid along the hallway, and told everybody he was glad to be done bending his back in the rain. He liked the downtown board meetings and the way men in suits nodded at him now. He liked using the word strategic and watching it work on people. She walked him to the door. He buttoned his coat with his jaw tightened like a man prepared to be admired. He kissed her knuckles like a lead in a movie. Then he was gone. By noon, she had locked her office door at Maple Ridge Middle School, where the principal had a corner rug with watercolor instruments, and the whiteboard wore a quote about kindness that was faded along the edges from years of sprays and erases. She wasn't the principal. She was the principal's glue when life came fast. 25 years in the district and 6 years as assistant principal had turned her into the kind of person whose phone number people didn't have to look up. But as far as anyone with a business card was concerned, she was a veteran teacher administrator who could inventory her whole building with the lights off. She opened the district intranet and scrolled. A red dot beside the budget tab blinked. She clicked. An alert spun up from a third-party compliance tool she had advocated for when she built the discretionary spreadsheet in September. The tool, beloved by auditors and hated by the impatient, had flagged 3 anomalies. They were small entries, petty even, $82 here, $114 there, a book fare refund out of an unexpected code. They were assigned to her login. She closed the tab, reopened it, staring not like a person in shock, but like a person measuring angles at a crime scene. If you want to frame a woman who keeps binders with inserts labeled in a neat hand, you begin with tiny gashes. You begin with numbers so small she looks crazy for noticing. She exhaled and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. Renee Cho answered on the first ring and said her name with the same laugh she had used when they were 19 and broke and pretending to enjoy the weird tea at the co-op. "Lydia Hart," Renee said. "I was thinking about you last week." Procrastinating a brief by stalking our old debate team's Facebook, "Do you have an hour?" Lydia asked. "For you, yes," Renee said. "For anyone else, they get my assistant and a week from Tuesday." They met at a coffee shop that had a chalkboard sign out front promising the best biscuit in Asheville and a barista who wore a beanie as a matter of belief. They sat at a corner table under a blown-up black and white photo of the mountains. Renee ordered a pour-over and a biscuit and then didn't touch either for 10 minutes as Lydia spoke. At first, the words came like they were balancing on something wobbly. Then they came steady. She told Renee about the 3 a.m. call in the calendar alert and how for the past 2 weeks, Colin had been watching her as if waiting for a funny trick to land. She told her about a new cologne and a mother-in-law with a creamy voice that always seemed dipped in something bitter. She told her about Founders Day and a table up front. Renee didn't interrupt except to ask questions that sounded like underlining. When Lydia finished, the coffee was cold. Renee finally moved the biscuit to a napkin and spoke. "Okay," she said, "don't freak out." Freaking out is energy we can't invoice. Lydia exhaled a half laugh she didn't feel like she'd earned. "Number 1, Renee continued, the school anomalies? I'll image your drives. IP logs, file hashes, timestamps. If somebody's seeding stuff to your login, they're sloppy or arrogant or both. And I bet you money your husband's friend is both. Number 2, the house. Your dad moved it into a revocable trust, right? Before you married? You and June co-trustees?" "Yes," Lydia said, feeling a small bright thing flicker in her chest as the word landed in air with a sound that promised structure. Dad thought we were overcomplicating it. "He did it anyway. The banker was kind. He explained it twice for me, and once slower for Dad." Renee nodded as if she were blessing a memory. "Good," she said. "That trust is not just paper. It's a steel gate with hinges that only open with 2 keys. He can try a quitclaim deed until he's blue and ridiculous, but it's still a quitclaim to a house that doesn't belong to the marriage. He'll try a postnup with intimidation attached. He'll hit you with rumors to soften you. He'll bring you to a social moment to burn the oxygen in the room. You will not step into his theater. You'll bring a ledger." Lydia's eyes stung clean. "And Patrick Voss?" Renee said, leaning back. "If that's who PV is, he's a family law show pony with a taste for shortcuts. He loves quitclaims the way bees love sugar, and he thinks the state notary handbook is fan fiction." Lydia snorted, and the sound surprised her with its defiance. "How do you know him?" she asked. "He tried to get a client to expedite a financial disclosure letter by cutting out a few inconvenient lines and pasting a signature," Renee said. "He's a copy stamper in a city that still has notaries with actual journals and standards. We'll ask the right notary the right questions." They made a plan. It was simple in the way reasonable things are simple. Lydia would continue to act unimpressed. She would smile at her mother-in-law and say as few words as possible. She would call the bank to confirm the co-trustee requirements were unchanged. She would not sign anything. She would let Renee image her devices. She would open her top dresser drawer and tape a flash drive in the back corner because her father had once told her everybody needs one good secret compartment no kid thinks to search. That afternoon, Evelyn arrived without calling. She always arrived without calling and always framed it like an honor. "Busy girl," she sang from the front door, calling Lydia by the same nickname she had used when Lydia was 28 and clearly not a girl. "Look at this house. So charming. You know, I was thinking, where do you keep your important papers? Colin never knows anything. Men, right? If something ever happened, somebody responsible would need to know where to find things." Lydia poured tea as if they were in a period drama and not a living room with a sagging sofa and a coffee ring on the side table. Evelyn wore a cream sweater set and a string of pearls that clicked softly against the pendant like a worry bead. She took the tea, sipped nothing, and settled herself with a sigh that announced she'd been long suffering from the burden of carrying herself so beautifully. "In a safe," Lydia said, making her voice light and letting a note of apology in. "Colin never remembers the combination. I keep it written on a sticky note in the silverware drawer. Honest to God, the man would lose his head if it weren't stitched on." Evelyn brightened in a way she could not fully hide, like a child who sees a cookie jar on a low shelf. "In the silverware drawer," she repeated, as if committing an endearment to memory. "That's where I keep my church pledge receipts because I like them close. Did I tell you I'm joining the board of the Symphony Guild? The chair adores me." "Everyone adores you, Evelyn," Lydia said, and there it was, the first honest thing either of them had said. People were drawn to Evelyn the way they were drawn to the idea of expensive curtains. She daubed a napkin at the corner of her mouth and looked around the room with the eyes of a woman trained to rank. "Founders' Day will be wonderful," she said. "We've got the front table." Colin is making a few remarks. "You don't mind being the calm one, do you? Lord knows he comes apart at the strangest times." "I can be calm," Lydia said, feeling her heart shift into a gear it hadn't used in years. The search began on the internet, where idiots leave footprints they think are confetti, then move to actual rooms where paper waits to be asked the right question. Renee's paralegal, a woman named Christy, with nails painted a blue so deep it was practically a vow, brought Lydia a portable drive and a gentle lecture about keeping her devices plugged in while the image ran. They checked the district logs. The anomalies filed under Lydia's login were created in a tiny window of time when she was leading a staff meeting at which 24 adults could swear she was using the projector to review the new iReady scores. The IP address that seeded the anomalies masked itself through a VPN service whose server happened to be mapped to a 3-block radius around Patrick's office. The email to the auditor that hinted at irregularities originated from a device with a telltale MAC address. Renee connected dots with a pencil and a mouth that smiled like a teacher watching a student figure out how to carry ones. They also went to see a notary. Her name was Virginia. Her desk was wedged between a tax prep office and a check cashing counter, and her hair was stacked like a cake. She'd seen everyone who ever tried to cheat a tiny town and had a way of smiling that did not waste kindness. Renee laid a photocopy on the desk. Lydia's signature, or something like it, sat on the line beneath a typed version of Lydia's name that contained an error Lydia had noticed 2 years ago on a PTA flyer. In the copy, Lydia was Lydia. The notary stamp was crisp and slightly tilted to the left. The date was 3 weeks ago. "I didn't stamp that," Virginia said before she even pulled her logbook. "Honey, I haven't stamped anything in that font in years." People with office suites love to download antique stamps. Renee smiled because she loved when the world rolled out a red carpet for the truth. "Do you keep a journal?" she asked. "I know not every notary does." Virginia tilted her head in mock offense. "Do I keep a journal?" she said, reaching for a burgundy book with coffee stains along the edge and edges that had gone soft from hands. "Darlin', I keep better journals than my pastor." They flipped to the date. Virginia ran the tip of her finger down the column with a kind of pride that felt like art. On that day, she had stamped a utility company worker who came in to notarize an address, affidavit, and an old couple with a durable power of attorney. No Lydia, no heart. She tapped the bottom of the page. "You see the final tally," she said. $25, 2 stamps, 2 signatures. I don't forget, and my receipts don't lie. When Lydia walked back to the car, she had to sit for a second with her hands on the wheel, looking at the windshield like it was a page, and at the world beyond it like it was print she could finally read. She could taste dignity the way you taste rain when you're a kid and stick your tongue out without thinking. Later, the bank. The manager was young in the way young bankers are, hair parted like an idea, smile tempered by an awareness that money often made people weird. He looked at Lydia's trust papers like a boy reading a love story at his parents' kitchen table, trying not to show that he was already on the heroine's side. "Revocable trust," he said. 2 co-trustees, you and your sister June. Origination predates marriage. Property tax assessments and insurance premiums paid out of trust account. No changes since 2003. He clicked and read, and Lydia watched the way the light from his screen hummed along his cheek. "So," he said, sitting back and letting the chair sigh, "any transfer of title requires both trustees. Quitclaims are like wishes unless the underlying asset sits where a quitclaim can reach. This one does not. I'm supposed to add 10 more sentences about how I can't give you legal advice, so here they are. I can't give you legal advice. But your father was prudent." He photocopied what he could and stamped pages for Renee. He looked at Lydia as if a person had just brought him a case that cleared itself. The rest of that week was a choreography of pretending. Lydia pretended not to taste the expensive cologne on Colin's shirt when she hugged him in the hallway. She pretended not to notice the pale imprint of chain store perfume on his lapels and the way his shirt cuffs looked new. She pretended to be impressed when he told her he had arranged for the mayor to mention them in her remarks. She pretended to be puzzled when he came home with printouts from a downtown event planner and made big circles in black ink to show the upfront table and the lectern. He pretended to be bored when she talked about school. He pretended to be concerned when she mentioned the auditor had called. He pretended to want to help. On Friday, a whisper slid through the staff lounge like steam. The auditor had called 2 teachers to ask about petty cash. The email from a concerned community member had suggested that someone had been skimming book fair proceeds. Somebody in the office had left the laminated visitor pass in the wrong bin, and it made them look sloppy. Lydia collected the passes and stacked them, thumb pressed against the photo corners to make the pile flush and straight. She called the auditor and spoke in sentences that sounded like somebody who was both patient and unwilling to be patronized. She sent him a zip file with a mirror of their discretionary ledger and a letter on Renee's letterhead that used phrases like chain of custody and hash mismatch with a grace that felt like architecture. Then she sat for a few minutes with the door closed and ate a saltine in quarters because she didn't trust her throat to behave if she added anything moist. That night, she and Colin stood on their front porch and looked at the dark. The neighbor's porch light made the hydrangea look blue. A fox cut across the street and vanished into the other dark. The mountain air did what mountain air does in October, told your lungs they had work to do. Colin leaned on the railing like a man with thoughts. "You good?" he asked, tone warm but created, like he was imitating a husband for a brochure. She nodded. "You look tired," he said. "The school is a lot. Maybe after Founders Day we sit down and talk about what's next. Maybe you don't work so hard. Maybe we make some new choices." His voice had the calm of a person who thinks the conclusion he's offering is a gift. "I like working hard," Lydia said. "I like my life when I'm tired, but not broken." Her father's hammer sat on a shelf in the entryway. She had kept it after he died, a small totem that felt heavier than physics said it should. 2 days before the gala, she opened the silverware drawer and stared at the sticky note she had placed there that morning, the one with the words, "Safe Code, 1989, scrawled in a hand that was not quite her own. She had written it with her left hand, letters looped wrong. She had placed it there in case Evelyn did what some part of Lydia knew she would. It wasn't nice, it wasn't polite, it was the hinge at the front of the dollhouse. That afternoon, Evelyn stopped by with a sack of mandarin oranges and remarkably clean nails. Lydia made tea again. Evelyn glided to the kitchen like a woman caught in a beam of light. She opened the silverware drawer and made a humming noise as if she were deciding between salad forks. She slid something beneath the knife tray. She closed the drawer. Lydia watched the reflection in the microwave door and noted the letter on the slip of paper in Evelyn's hand as it disappeared. She filed the letter in her mind, then filed her rage. Later that night, Lydia peeked into the safe and smiled. The code 1989 did not open it. The real code belonged to a year only 2 people on the planet would think to try. Her father's favorite Cleveland baseball season, the one he'd watch on VHS as if the men in the uniforms could hear him when he shouted. By dawn, she was ready to believe she had imagined the whole thing, because sometimes sanity loves to pretend it is excessive. Then, near noon, the district auditor called and used a tone reserved for missionaries and men who wear their sunglasses on their hats. "Principal Hart," he said. "Assistant principal," she corrected gently. "We had an anonymous email about your discretionary fund," he continued, letting the correction slide. "We have to ask questions. It's not fun. Sorry to be the messenger. Ask," Lydia said. "I have answers. I also have a letter that will be more interesting than your questions." When she hung up, she set the phone face down, pressed her palms to the desk, and smiled at the buzz of anger in her forearms. Then she dialed June. Her sister answered from Maine on what sounded like the side of a road in shade, kids in the background coiling their energy through the line. "Hey, Lyd," June said. "You okay? You've got your I'm fine voice on. I need you to attend Founders Day from the safety of your couch," Lydia said, "and maybe keep your phone charged." "Say no more," June said, voice changing in the way sisters' voices do when life tries to pretend it's an only child. "Do I get to clap in my slippers?" "You might," Lydia said. That night, she and Renee sat at the kitchen table with the kind of seriousness that makes the dog tilt his head. The window above the sink showed the last slice of evening. They walked through what would happen if Colin tried to demand a signature in public. They rehearsed two versions of a sentence, because the difference between this and that matters when somebody holds a microphone like a knife. "They love the theater of dominance," Renee said. "Make it about paper. Numbers and signatures. Don't perform fury. Perform administration. It terrifies them." "I can do administration," Lydia said, and for the first time in days, she laughed in a way that made her eyes crease at the corners without feeling like they were cracking. On the day of the gala, the air was clean in a way that felt like it had been washed overnight. The Blue Ridge Conservatory's event hall had been polished into a place where butter knives looked like jewelry. The door opened to a lobby where donors pretended not to look for each other. The backdrop with the conservatory's logo waited for people to pose and make a square that would be liked and then forgotten. Lydia walked in, wearing a navy silk dress she had bought 5 years ago and barely wore, and a pair of low heels that even her feet forgave. Her hair was pinned up in a way that made her look like herself, even if she didn't spend time on mirrors. Her purse weighed more than it should have for something so small. The flash drive inside was a sliver. The affidavits were thin. Truth doesn't weigh much. It just sits there being itself. Colin met her near the coat check and kissed her on the cheek again, like a man who had studied a textbook on women's reactions and wanted to score a 90. He looked like money in a suit with a better cut than usual. His eyes darted the way his eyes used to when he was building a deck, calculating, checking that each beam was willing to bear the load. "Ready?" he asked. "I brought my appetite," Lydia said, and let the tiniest smile curl at the corner of her mouth, because being witty with a liar is a private pleasure. At their table, Evelyn wore a pearl in her hair that echoed the ones at her throat. She patted Lydia's hand and lowered her chin and expressed with her eyes that she knew the weight of a noble moment and could carry it gracefully. "We are loved tonight," she said, spreading her arms slightly to indicate the rumor of attention around them. Across the room, a woman in a honey-colored suit checked her phone and then tucked it into a slim clutch. Her hair was a smooth sheet like an idea you hadn't thought you'd ever see in real life. She took a seat one table behind Lydia's. She wore a badge that read, "Program Consultant," even though she didn't consult on any program anyone else could see. Tess Monroe looked exactly like what Colin would say he wasn't doing if he were caught doing it. The MC took the stage and did a joke that a third of the room found funny and a third found unfunny and a third didn't hear because they were looking at someone's dress. The mayor stepped up and offered remarks that included words like resilient and vibrant and we and the future, words that do their jobs politely and then go home tired. She gestured toward the heart table when she talked about volunteers. A small bubble of applause rolled toward them and popped. Colin's knees bounced behind the tablecloth. His fingers worried the corner of the envelope he had brought. He squeezed Lydia's hand and made it look romantic, and she wondered whether his thumb always picked up a tremor when he lied, or whether his body had been lying for him so long it had developed professional habits. The salad was the kind of salad that was really an excuse for a ring of cucumber to wear a hat of goat cheese. The quartet slid into a piece every television viewer would identify as classical. The MC introduced the mayor's husband with a joke about marriage that made Lydia's chest shift in a slow, tectonic way. Then he cleared his throat. "It's my pleasure," he said, "to introduce a man who gives his time to our city, who understands that civic life is a team sport, and who wanted to say a few words tonight about gratitude. Please welcome Mr. Colin Hart." Colin rose and buttoned his jacket, even though it didn't need buttoning. He'd practiced that move in the mirror. He took the steps to the stage like there were exactly 4 of them, and he had counted them in a dream. "Friends," he said, leaning into the microphone with a gravity he had rented for the night. 25 years alongside a good woman is no small thing. People who didn't know either of them heard depth. People who knew them enough to know their names and jobs heard a preamble. "There comes a time," he continued gently, "when we have to be honest about how love changes. When we have to be courageous enough to admit we've outgrown roles that served us in one season but no longer serve us in another. I am here to honor the past and to ask for kindness in the future." Evelyn dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue that had waited all week to be asked. Tess looked at her nails, and then at her phone, and then at the back of Colin's head, as if she were tracking a piece of technology about to glitch. "Lydia," he said, turning toward her, his smile luminous with the performance of empathy. "I'm asking you tonight to sign some paperwork that will make this transition fair for both of us. It's just a clarification. The house, a few assets, things we should align before we go in different directions. No drama, just respect." The envelope rested on the lectern like a beloved pet. The lectern light burned a circle that made the paper glow. Cameras lifted like sunflowers to a star. Lydia stood with a calm that belonged to a woman who had attended 15 promotion ceremonies for kids who weren't hers and had smiled like they were. She looked at the MC, and he looked at her, and she lifted her hand the way a teacher does when she wants the room to stop talking. The MC angled the microphone toward her. She walked to the stage with the kind of unhurried step that makes onlookers quiet. "Thank you, Colin," she said, and the microphone spread her voice across the hall until people on the edge of the room stopped chewing. "You're right about one thing. Truth does require courage." She set her bag on the edge of the lectern. She slid out a slim folder of her own. She smiled toward the back of the room where a woman leaned against the wall holding nothing but a phone and competence. "Tonight is a party," Lydia said, "and I'm sorry to ask it to do more. But since we've turned the stage into a desk, let's do what desks are for." She tapped the lectern. A screen behind her woke up with a soft shift of light. Image 1 appeared, a notary log, a tight shot of a date, a neat column of entries and the totals at the bottom, and the absence of a name that was supposed to be there. "This is a notary journal," Lydia said, tone sweet as if she were teaching a lesson to a kid who did not know yet that he loved math. "It is a record of what actually happened on a day somebody says something else did. It is boring to look at until you realize how much it loves the truth." There was a ripple across the room. People who had never thought about notary journals sat up like a dog hearing a lid pop off a jar of peanut butter. Image 2, a screenshot of a PDF's metadata. The created by line said something in an unflattering way. "The last modified." A timestamp lined up with a time when Lydia had been in a staff meeting with 20 witnesses and a projector. "This is the document I was asked to sign," Lydia said, looking at the envelope with a tilt of her head that suggested both sadness and clarity. "And this is proof the person who made it was too lazy to pull the signature line from a document with my name spelled properly." Silence did what it does when a room loses its appetite for spectacle. It listened. "If you were hoping for tears," Lydia said, keenly aware of the reporter near the plant, "I cried 3 weeks ago in my pantry with a jar of pickles at my feet because it was the only place I could stand upright without showing the dog something I couldn't explain." A small laugh in the back loosened the tension enough to make it viable. "And," she said, tone tightening like a bow pulled across a string, "if you were hoping I would be stupid, then you should have chosen a different woman to marry." Renee stepped forward just enough into the light to stop being an idea and become a person. The mayor looked at her, assessed the cut of her blazer, and nodded with a particular relief people reserve for professionals walking into fires with hoses. "We've also sent a letter to the district," Lydia said, glancing toward the table where the assistant superintendent and the auditor had been trying to sink into their napkins. "The small dollar amounts moved under my login?" They were inserted via an IP address that traces back through a VPN to an office near the courthouse, one with a name on the door and a reputation for creative paperwork. Patrick Voss was not in the room. He had chosen to miss dinner in favor of a dinner of his own, with a client and a bourbon he couldn't afford. It was his great luck, because if he had been, he would have had to decide in the space of one heartbeat whether to pretend to be indignant or to pretend not to be present. Instead, Tess shifted in her chair and looked like a person who had finally realized that a bridge she had been invited to cross wasn't finished on the other side. Lydia turned toward Evelyn. She didn't want to. She did it anyway. "Evelyn," she said, "you came by with mandarins and questions about important papers. You've always been very good at looking concerned while you take what you came for. You're good at making a room love you. I will not love you that way. Here is what I will say, because you're a mother and you raised a son who thinks public threats are romance. I'm sorry you never taught him any better way to ask for his life. I'm not sorry, I learned." The tissue in Evelyn's fingers made no sound. Her mouth became a line that could have sliced paper. Colin tried to speak into the mic without touching it, a skill he didn't have. His voice came out thin and without its rented gravity. "She is making a scene," he said, and heard as the words formed that he had chosen the one sentence an audience hates to hear when a woman tells the trouble of her own house. "I'm making a record," Lydia said lightly. "There's a difference." She looked down at the papers. She replaced them, slid everything back into her bag, and closed the clasp with a tiny click the front table heard. She looked into the room and saw faces she'd known for 2 decades, faces she had seen shocked when their student had gotten her first A, faces she had seen when their boy had been suspended, faces she'd seen praying at school concerts and wiping eyes at graduation. She lifted her chin. "We're going to eat dinner now," she said. "And the quartet is going to play that song my father used to hum when he ironed his shirts. And the mayor is going to say something kind about the library. And those of you who came here to celebrate something bigger than any of us are going to do that with gusto. The rest can make of this what you like." She handed the mic to the MC the way one returns a borrowed sweater in good condition. The applause started somewhere near the entrance and moved like weather across the room. It wasn't unanimous. Some people held their claps like a coin they weren't sure they wanted to spend. Some people clapped with their hands and their faces. The quartet, because they were excellent at their jobs, picked up a melody and slipped it into the air as if nothing unexpected had happened. At the table, Evelyn didn't speak. She folded her tissue into a slit-thin strip and slid it under her plate for later, because useless misery loves to pack a souvenir. Tess rose and placed her napkin on the table and walked, without looking at Colin, toward the exit. A reporter slid out of a chair and followed her into the lobby like a small bird. The mayor, God bless her local heart, handed Lydia a glass of water without comment. The assistant superintendent leaned over and whispered, "I always liked you better than the new inbox anyway." Colin stared at the envelope like it had betrayed him, and for one surreal second, Lydia felt sorry for him. The way a person flickers for a second when watching somebody else watch a castle they've misbuilt fall under its own silliness. They ate. They listened to the mayor. They breathed. The next day did not come quietly because nothing after a public correction does. It brought a letter from the district auditor that used the word cleared. It brought a call from the bank manager that began with a legal disclaimer and ended with a laugh he tried to pretend was a cough when he told her that a person with a bridegroom's grin had tried to bully a teller into a wire transfer and been asked to leave. It brought a plate of cookies from Mrs. Delgado across the street with a note that read, "I always wondered why his eyes moved so fast. Is that rude?" It brought a text from Tess. "I'm out. I'm sorry. Not to you, to myself, but I am sorry." It brought a voicemail from Evelyn. saturated with something that might have been regret and might have been the performance of it, asking if she could come by to explain and make things right and salvage what people might say. Lydia sent one text, "Not today." She practiced the pleasure of ending a sentence. Colin came home with anger inside him like an untrained dog. He paced the living room as if counting steps could repair a demolished narrative. He lifted the envelope in the air and shook it like it contained a genie too stubborn to appear. "You embarrassed me," he said. "You embarrassed yourself." "You threatened me," she said, "in public. You attempted to coerce a signature. You seeded a rumor about my job." He rubbed at his forehead the way he always did when he wanted to look put upon. He sat on the edge of the couch and made his posture into a martyrdom. "I did not seed a rumor," he said. "I suggested a truth that would prevent worse." "What worse?" she asked in a voice so soft even the dog cocked his head. What worse could there be than teaching children to believe the loudest person on a stage tells the truth about a woman's life? He stared at a spot on the rug as if it contained a hole he could fall into and avoid responsibility by dwelling underground. When he looked up, his eyes found the photos on the mantel. His favorite deck, her father in a ball cap, the two of them young in a way that made her want to protect them, and he fumbled for what, in a different movie, would be redemption. "I want to be happy," he said and meant it. And the sentence walked into the air and behaved like a selfish child in a grocery store. "I don't think you know what the word means," she said with a sadness that didn't need salt. "You said we're a team as long as I sit on the bench and clap for your highlight reel." He stood like he might leave or stay forever, or fall asleep on his feet. Then he left. He didn't slam the door because he liked to think of himself as composed. The absence of the slam was a small kindness, and it made her cry at last, long, quiet, shoulders shaking, not pretty. She cried for the 25 years she had put her head down and made enough dinners with enough lemon zest to make a life smell pleasant. She cried for the girl she had been, who thought a man's strong arms meant a strong character. She cried for her father and his hammer, and for the way he would have muttered, "You did good, kid," as if the grammar of love matters. Then she washed her face and fed the dog and put the flash drive in the safe and wrote a note to herself that read, "Tidy up after victory, too." Life did a thing it does when you expect it to fall apart in one direction, and it falls apart in a semicircle instead. The story of the gala did what stories do in small cities with big phones. It ran. People told it to each other in the bread aisle and on bleachers and with their heads bent over office desks at 3. It was recast. Villains turned their eyebrows down and heroes asked questions. Partners reached for each other under the duvet and said things like, "We're good, right?" with a gratitude that made them kinder for a while. By the end of the week, the Blue Ridge Downtown Partnership had asked Colin to resign. They sent him an email larded with words like optics and integrity. The board chair, a man with a talent for being liked that had nothing to do with goodness, called and used a soft voice to say, "This is a season, we'll circle back," and meant, "See you never." The bank canceled his access to the trust portal in a way that technically did not exist because he had never had it in the first place. Tess cleaned out the tiny antique desk in the spare bedroom where she had never written a thing except her name in the margin of a notebook next to a doodle she didn't let him see. She left a key on the kitchen counter and a note that said, "Good luck being a better person," which was either beautiful or cruel or both, depending on how long you looked at it. Evelyn put the house she loved on the market and told her friends the market had turned unkind and she had always wanted something smaller, and then cried into her closet because the market had not turned unkind, and she had never wanted anything smaller. She tried to sell her pearls to a jeweler who told her imitation string pearls were not a market investment, and she said words to him she had taught herself never to say in public because she had the weight of a life on her tongue and nowhere to set it down. At school, Lydia took her first full breath in 3 weeks while standing at the side of the gym during an assembly about kindness. A seventh grader named Ava, who had spent most of the year looking at the world with the side eye of a cat, approached and stood a few feet away until adults had finished talking to each other. Then she opened her mouth, and a sentence came out that made Lydia's throat lurch in the good way. "My mom said you're the reason I want to go to school again," Ava said, "because you didn't let mean people win." Lydia put a hand over her heart and made a sound that wasn't a word. Ava shrugged like she hadn't said anything worth a response and walked away with her purple backpack strap dangling in a way that made Lydia want to tuck it back onto her shoulder like a mother would, and she didn't, and that was right. In November, a letter came from a bank in flat font with a high-minded logo and a list of numbers that looked like a blessing disguised as math. The small bridge loan she had made to Colin's old contracting LLC years ago, back when she believed in the myth of a husband as a second savings account, had matured with penalties and interest because he had ignored it long enough to make it interesting. The check was not large in the way wealthy people use the word. It was large in the way a woman uses the word when she realizes she can hand a rent check to herself for the first time. She took the check to the bank on a day when the air tasted like a penny. She set it on the counter for the young banker with the kind part to behold. He smiled and nodded like a person who loves paperwork as religious text, and processed it with a little flourish of approval, as if stamping was a sending out of good. She walked out with a plan in her pocket that had been growing in her mind the way bulbs do winter work where nobody can see. For months she had been daydreaming about a room that smelled like new pages and coffee, a place where people could come in and sit down and not have to buy anything and drink something warm and read something better than a screen. A place where kids could get free tutoring on Saturdays and women could print forms for nothing, and men with tired backs could rest and wash it down with a book about resilience that wasn't saccharine. A place where, if someone came in with a notary question, they would be directed to Virginia because journals matter. A place with a name that felt like a needle and thread. Honey and hem, she thought one night while stirring tea, the vowels pleasant in her mouth. Sweetness and seam. She found a storefront 2 blocks off the main drag, a brick facade with a window that reflected the sky like a lake. The landlord was a man in his late 60s, with the demeanor of a dog that had been yelled at and still loved everybody. He looked at her and saw a woman whose shoulders knew about boxes and whose palms knew about receipts. He quoted her a number and then lowered it by a sliver, the way decent men do when they remember they have daughters. She signed a lease with a pen that felt heavier than a pen. She painted the walls a white that looked like daylight even in rain. She ordered shelves from a carpenter who came recommended by Mrs. Delgado's cousin because life is a loop of cousins and hammers. She wrote a list of publishers she wanted and a list of used books she would beg from the city. She wrote "open" on a chalkboard sign and underlined it twice. The first morning, Lydia turned the key and flipped the sign to open on Maple Ridge's newest little shop. The bell above the door made a jingle that sounded less like commerce and more like permission. A boy came in with his father and asked quietly if he could sit on the floor in the corner and read the dog encyclopedia. A woman in scrubs bought a paperback and left without a bag because she didn't believe in bags anymore. A retired teacher brought a stack of books tied with twine and a cake that had sunk a little in the middle but tasted like recovery. June arrived 3 days later from Maine with a suitcase that looked like it had survived someone else's war and a grin that made Lydia feel like childhood wasn't a loan you had to pay back. She peered at the shelves and ran a finger along the spines and read the staff picks that were handwritten with the kind of care that turns recommendations into minor love letters. Dad would have sat in that chair, June said, pointing at a worn armchair near the back, and pretended not to cry when you told him how you got here. Dad cried, Lydia said. He just did it with his face away from the light. They made tea in the back and talked about nothing for 20 minutes, which is how sisters say I am here without making either the other or the universe suspicious. In December, the city did what cities do between Thanksgiving and the first week of January, pretending to pause while carrying on with a mania for checklists. The story of Founders Day became less a story and more a piece of local history people referenced without thinking. Colin sat in his mother's small apartment with blinds that used to be white and looked online for jobs and found out that a person can be qualified and still be radioactive when people search your name and find a room's applause going to the woman you threatened at a podium. He worked part-time at a supply store selling the very screws he used to buy by the bucket, then started driving a rideshare in a car that coughed when you asked it for a hill. He picked up a woman outside a yoga studio one afternoon in January, and she got in and met his eyes in the rear view and looked away, like she recognized him, and then remembered that she had somewhere else to be now, and that's what she would tell him if he played that night over in his mind. Evelyn hosted New Year's dinner on a folding table, covered with a cloth that had belonged to her mother, because dignity is part heirloom, part performance, and part habit. She invited people who had been around long enough to know her good and her nonsense. She served ham and pretended not to notice when people looked at the new apartment with the tender curiosity they reserve for proof that nobody outruns payback forever. She sat on her couch afterward and stared at a photo of herself at 27 on a beach in a yellow suit and wondered whether she'd been better than she was now or just prettier, and whether those were ever the same thing in any real way. Lydia stocked shelves and wiped tables and watched women exhale in her store, watched men take their caps off like church, watched teenagers lean against the window and talk at each other with all the sincerity and cruelty of people who will later have to apologize to themselves. She loved them with her eyes and her steady presence, because that was the way she knew, and she learned to let herself be loved back in tiny ways that felt like slings of light. A man from the neighborhood came in with a flyer and asked if she would let a veterans group meet once a month in the back. She measured the space with her eyes and said yes. A woman asked if she would stock a book about forgiveness that was honest enough to help her forgive herself for the things she'd been complicit in. Lydia laughed and said she'd order 2. On a Thursday in late January, a small woman with, of all things, a notary sign hung around her neck, came in during a slow hour and bought a coffee and asked if she could sit and write letters. She wrote 3 and stamped 2 and sealed 1, and then looked up and asked whether Lydia ever thought about how paper outlives everything. And Lydia smiled because she knew intimately that it does. The woman introduced herself as Virginia and said to call if anybody needed a faithful stamp, and Lydia wrote her number in a tidy hand on a card and taped it near the register with a piece of washi tape that had little hammers on it. Later that afternoon, Renee came by with a bottle of sparkling apple cider, because timing is its own language and some days call for bubbles. She leaned against the counter and reported the unremarkable miracles. The district had closed the file. Patrick had received a letter from the Bar Association with a tone that suggested his future was about to narrow. Tess had gotten on a plane to a different city and had posted a picture of an airport dawn with a caption that made Lydia believe in fresh starts, even for people who had helped to hurt. Colin had sent an email that said, without grandstanding, that he was sorry. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for anything. A day later, he sent another that said, "This isn't who I wanted to be." He attached nothing but a sentence, and for once she believed him a little, because sometimes ruin is a gift disguised as a cul-de-sac. In February, on a clear day that made the mountains look like sentences written in a hand she could finally read, Lydia closed the store early and drove to a bluff. She stood there in a coat that had cost too much and felt worth every dollar, and watched a hawk hang in the air longer than physics allows. She said a sentence out loud and half laughed because she could hear herself doing it like a character in a movie. She said, "I'm okay." Then she went home and burned garlic and made a sauce that tasted better than anything that came out of a jar, and ate it standing over the stove, and felt, in the bones of her feet, that she was standing in a life she recognized again. In March, Honey and Hem hosted its first reading. 30 people crowded into the narrow room and clapped at sentences the author read that made them twinge in good ways. The bell over the door jingled twice during the event, and Lydia, instead of resenting the interruption, enjoyed the little punctuation marks the sound gave the night. June manned the register and forgot to charge 2 people and then tried to chase them down the street, and the people ran for fun and then turned around and paid, and they all laughed. And for 10 minutes, Lydia lived inside a sitcom in the autumn of her life, and it was gorgeous. One evening after closing, she wiped the counter and counted the till and wrote a note in the notebook she kept by the register for days when she needed to file gratitude. She wrote, "Today, Ava came in and asked if she could read poetry for an hour. Then she waited for permission like a bird waits for a thermal draft, and when I said yes, she sat and read Nisi's poems for girls, with a face like oxygen was good." She wrote, "Today a man found a used copy of a novel his mom loved, and he bent over it in the corner and cried in a way that did not embarrass him." She wrote, "Today my house key felt necessary in my pocket in a way that made me put my hand on it every minute for an hour." She closed the book and put it under the register, a little hinge hiding behind wood. When spring turned the mountains the color of early peas, she got a postcard from Virginia. It read, "Just married a couple at the Lookout. They promised each other receipts before romance. I told them about you." Colin drove his rideshare on a route that often took him past Honey and Hem. He never turned his head, because we are a species that sometimes thinks not looking prevents other people from seeing us. He stopped one afternoon to pick up a woman with a laptop bag. She got in and buckled and looked down, and then looked up and said, "You know, you should stop in there sometime." The coffee is good, and the woman who runs it knows how to recommend a book like a good aunt. He said he would, and he did not, and that was fine. In June, Lydia received a brown envelope from the court that contained a piece of paper with the word dissolved in an official font. She wasn't sure whether to frame it or burn it. She did neither. She put it in the safe and closed the door without writing the code on a sticky note for anyone. She went for a walk around dusk and let the porch lights of her neighborhood be the stars they were intended to be, for people who didn't always have the energy to find their necks in the dark. She sat on her front steps with a mug of tea, and Mr. Delgado came over with strawberries in a paper bowl and told her about his knees. The dog put his head on her knee and sighed. In July, the city did its festival thing. Tents sprouted. Artists set up. People in sun hats drank lemonade and watched other people in sun hats. Fathers carried kids on shoulders and called it exercise. Lydia took a midday shift at the store and watched a girl reach for a book about girls doing difficult things and then stop, look at her mother, and ask, "Will I like it?" And watch the mother say yes without looking, and watch the girl believe her and accept the book like a prophecy. She thought, "My job is to say yes when people reach for something that feeds them." A year after Founders Day, a letter came in an envelope with Colin's handwriting on it. Lydia took it into the back and opened it with a letter opener, shaped like a feather that June had bought because every woman in their family had a thing for overdone tools. The letter was not long and did not ask for what she could not give. He wrote, "I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if there's a way to say I was wrong that doesn't make me look like I'm asking to feel better. This isn't that. I just want you to know that the life I tried to take from you wasn't mine to try, and you defending it taught me something I should have known. When you told the truth on a stage, I saw myself like a stranger sees a man on a camera. I didn't like him. I'm trying to be somebody I like. That's it. Be well." She read it twice, then placed it back in the envelope and filed it behind the insurance policy in the safe. She did not write him back. She didn't overthink that choice. She just let it sit. The next Founders Day came, and the conservatory sent an invitation addressed to Miss Lydia Harten-Guest. She hung it on the corkboard behind the register, tucked under a flyer for a community choir and a handwritten note from a kid who had used the free tutoring and passed algebra in a way that made his eyes go wide at himself for a week. She didn't go. She made a pot of soup and delivered 2 bowls to Mrs. Delgado and watched a movie where people dance under streetlights and don't get robbed. She stood on the porch at 9 and listened to someone in the neighborhood play a saxophone badly and smiled because trying is holy. Some nights, when the store was closed and the world felt like it had balances after all, she would write. Not a book, just pages. She wrote about her father and the hinge on the dollhouse. She wrote about June and the road trip when they were teenagers and got lost and ended up at a diner where a woman named Dolores gave them pie and the best directions anyone's ever given. She wrote about the way a notary's journal looked when it was pulled from a desk and the pride in the way a woman tapped a line and said, "That's the truth, right there." She wrote about the feeling of a microphone in her hand and the way the cord made a shape on the floor that looked like a lasso, and how good it felt to drop it gently and leave it like a tool in a toolbox instead of a weapon on a stage. She wrote about paper and promise and the simple heroism of filing. On the anniversary of the night she had stood on that stage, she stood on the small rug in front of her counter and spoke out loud in the empty store as if someone had asked her a question. She said, "When someone tries to take your house with a smile, bring receipts. When they try to strip your good name with a rumor, bring witnesses. When they try to make a stage into a courtroom, bring your own light." Then she flicked off the lights and let the room go dark in a friendly way and went home. In August, she stood behind the table at Honey and Hem and watched a tall teen boy put down a stack of comic books on the counter, like treasure. His hands were bigger than his body knew what to do with. He wore a hoodie in heat because teenage boys insist. He loved the way the characters talked to each other in bubbles and said the thing nobody said out loud. He dug in his pocket for bills and came up $6 short. He looked at the books as if he'd done something wrong by wanting them that much. Lydia slid her finger along the edge of one and said, "You're a regular." He looked at her, and then at the door, and then at his shoes. And she shook her head and said, "You're a regular," again, and rang him up for the money he had. He took the books in his arms the way he might one day hold his child and walked out into the white afternoon. That evening, she wrote in her notebook, "Today I remembered that power is not one big slam of a gavel. It's a million tiny yeses." She underlined it twice and closed the cover. She sat on her stoop and watched a little parade of gnats dance in the last gold light and thought, as she almost always did when she let her mind roam around itself, about the kind of woman she wanted to be. The list was simple and rang like a bell. Honest, brave, without meanness, ready with proof, never afraid of quiet. A breeze moved through the hydrangeas and made the blue lighter for a second. The dog came and put his head on her bare knee, and she said absent-mindedly, like a person who names the weather, "Court is adjourned." Then she laughed at herself and went in to rinse the coffee pot and set the alarm and locked the door to the place where she served her life to herself like a generous meal. She woke the next morning and stood in the mirror to try to see what other people saw when they saw her. A woman with lines around her mouth and at the corners of her eyes, evidence of a life that did not fail to look at things. Hair a color her students would call brown, and her mother would call chestnut, because language is a kindness we can give ourselves. Shoulders a little forward from years of putting kids first and papers on consoles. She didn't look like Triumph. She looked like a person who did the next right thing and then did it again. That day, a man, someone she didn't know, but whose name she would later learn and add to the mental index of good people, came in with 2 daughters trailing him. They were twins, which is to say they were 2 distinct people who had shared a womb. He had the look of someone who'd been recently left and had not decided whether to call it abandonment or relief. He circled the store and picked up a book about starting over without pretending it isn't difficult. He brought it to the counter. He had the face of a person who hopes books are orthopedics for the soul. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, regret riding shotgun with humor. "Do you have an aisle where you can fix me?" She did not say, "You're not broken, just misassembled," because she was tired of being the kind of woman who used metaphors when a man needed instructions. She handed him a note card on which she had scrawled, in a hand that looked like it trusted itself, 3 little things that had helped her. They were embarrassingly basic and rich because of it. Drink water. Fix one broken thing in your house with your own hands. Tell your daughters one story every night about when you were a kid and not proud. He took the card like she had given him a map, folded it into his wallet, and left with a book held like a life jacket. That night, she sat on the floor and put her back against the edge of her bed like a teenager, and let music she had loved in 1998 fill the room and thought, with a surprise that still felt slightly forbidden, because she had been married to a man who wanted to hand her feelings along with instructions, that she liked her life. She felt a little guilt at first, like being okay was a betrayal of whoever thought she should only be okay if she had a partner. Then she remembered the way he had set the envelope on the lectern and asked her to condemn herself with a signature, and the guilt drained from her body like a last bad sip of coffee into a sink. On the second Founders' Day after the night, everyone in town would remember as that night. A woman approached her in the grocery store aisle by the canned tomatoes. She looked too polished to be from the neighborhood and too tired to be from television. She said hello in a voice that would have sounded familiar if Lydia had watched the local news. She introduced herself. She said she had been in the room that night and had kept her mouth shut because she was a donor, and donors care too much about the temperature of rooms. She said she wished she had stood and clapped first. She said, "I think about you when my husband tells a story where I am the clown, and next time he does, I will stop him." Lydia smiled because activism on the micro level is how daughters learn how to sit at their own dinner tables. Life did not become easy. It became honest. Colin remarried a woman who did not live in Lydia's city and did not wish to know what he had been. Lydia wished them enough quiet truth to keep their house from needing a stage. Evelyn got sick and got well and got a little softer and ate pound cake without justifying it and volunteered at the thrift store, where the people who worked there taught her the names of fabrics, and she taught them how to wrap breakables like they might matter to the person who buys them. Tess sent Lydia a postcard from Minneapolis that read, "New job, new skyline, new rules. I'm sorry." Lydia pinned it to the corkboard under the veterans meeting flyer and the book club sign-up. The store became what Lydia had wanted it to be, a small, bright hinge in a town's day. People came in cranky and left less so. A mother sat in the back and cried into a coffee while her baby slept, and an old man walked over and handed her a napkin without a story attached. A kid brought in a poem she had written and asked if Lydia would put it in the window, and Lydia did. And 3 days later, a stranger came in and said the poem had made him go to work in a better mood. And the kid came back that afternoon and stood in front of her poem with the posture of a person trying to understand that her words can change air and not just her own head. On the third Founders' Day, Lydia put a bouquet of grocery store flowers in a jar near the register and smiled at the memory of chandeliers and lecterns, not because she missed them, but because she had learned how to turn spectacle into a story she could tell without shaking. She still had the flash drive in the safe. She still had the affidavits. She still had the notary's number on a card taped near the register. She had no desire to open any of it. She kept it because life is messy and because you do not throw out your seatbelt once you know how to drive. She wrote one more note in her register notebook. Proof is love when you offer it to yourself. Then she did what she always did. She turned the sign at the door to open. She stood behind the counter and said good morning to the first stranger who walked in. She recommended a book like an aunt. She sold a cup of coffee and printed a form for free and set a child up with a pencil and the confidence to try a math problem twice. She lived that day so well that if her father had walked in, he would have stood at the edge of the rug, smiled at the shelves, and said in a voice that never tried to hurry her, "That'll do."